Okay, I collect questions.
Thank you very much for the presentations. I would like to ask for the first one. High school skilled workers were explaining this change in wages and so on, and switching from jobs. I'm wondering if there is not a change in the education level, so what is allowing them to move from less productive sectors to more productive sectors? I don't know, maybe some measure of informal education, for example, this crash course that makes you convert to a data scientist or programmer or something of the sort that were like booming during the pandemics. And maybe that's, I don't know if you can catch that, but in the data, but maybe that is, I don't know, an explanative factor. And another one for the second one. Can you elaborate a bit more about the pricing rule for Petrobras? Because I think it's important also for the case of Argentina. So, yeah.
Thank you very much for your interesting presentations. Sorry, I have to. I have one question for Arindrajit Dube. Well, two questions actually. First of all, the phenomenon you are describing is very interesting, but it only concerns 4 years, and you compare it to periods of much longer. Of a much longer period. So how sure are you that this is really a phenomenon which is not just a temporary blip, but is really something which is going on and will be sustained somehow? And what I missed in your discussion, which was very interesting, is also the role of institutional factors. For instance, the whole package delivered by Joe Biden and the American stimulus package. To what extent did this play a role in all these developments? Maybe. And you also did not say anything about something which your right-hand neighbor would very much deplore, about trade unions or something like that. So the institutional factors actually are totally absent in your story. And is this because you think they are not relevant, or? So that's my question to you. And to Andrew, I also have two questions. One is about why is there no role for the trade unions? Because you could expect nowadays that, given the climate and also the labor scarcity, that trade unions could become a more important element in the story. And you did not really explain that. You only deplore that's not the case. But why not? And the second thing I would like to ask you is, to what extent do you think that there's room for policy coordination between the countries? Because I don't think you discussed that, but only mentioned all these individual measures, but they could learn from each other and try to coordinate. So that's my second question. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Can you raise it again? Okay. Christian Schroeder, then Sarah Storm, and then we continue the group over there. And I think I come back to that. That's our first round, then we will have a second one.
Okay, thank you. I'll try to be quick. Thank you for your very nice presentations. I have a question for the first and the second presentation. So the first one, if I understood it correctly, then your point was that there's a higher rate of inflation, of wage inflation for low income or like the low income percentiles because of a stronger labor market tightening. But is this consistent with the charts that you showed at the beginning, the time series evidence of employment and occupations that showed that there was actually a stronger decrease in employment after COVID for the low income employment relationships? Is it because you look at the rate of change, and if so, like the rate of change of employment to capture labor market tightening? And if so, would your results also be robust to looking at the kind of trend deviation? And my second question is on Brazil. I recently started working on Brazil, and what blew my mind was the fact that the credit market is heavily regulated. 50% of lending is earmarked lending, which interest rate ceilings that are below the Selic, the monetary policy rate. and the free market lending rates are around 50%. So how would you take that into account in your explanation of inflation and wage inflation and also price inflation? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I enjoyed all the three presentations, but I only have one question for Professor Dube. That is, you talk about an unexpected compression of wage inequality or the wage structure, real wages. My question is, did you deflate the nominal wages per quartile using quartile-specific consumer price indices? Because there is strong evidence showing that the consumer price index for the lowest quartile, or the lowest whatever, 10%, has increased more than the CPI for, let's say, the richest 20 or 30 or 40%. If that is the case, the compression in real terms would be smaller. I'm wondering what your view is on this.
Hi, Esra Ulu. I have a question for Lilian. I really enjoyed the presentation. I think it's always interesting to learn from Brazil's experience. So you spoke about using the exchange rate as a tool to kind of control the distributional conflict. I guess some could argue that using exchange rate for that purpose could come at the expense of tradable sector performance, because very appreciated exchange rates, increase the dependency on imported inputs and hurt competitiveness. So I was wondering your thoughts about that.
Okay, thank you very much. There will be a second round of questions. Who would like to start?
Sure. Okay, so let me go in the order. The first question was about the change in education level. So, education levels didn't change very much in this period in terms of overall workforce, because even if you change education level of people who are, sort of potentially changing jobs, et cetera, that would be a small fraction of people overall. But here's the interesting thing, is that we actually saw a reduction in the U.S. in people going to college, which actually all happened through reduction in community college participation, which is exactly where the vocational training would be. So if anything that sharpens the puzzle, certainly it wasn't the case that these people changing jobs were more likely to get some training. If anything, vocational training fell, so that wouldn't be the reason. So it's mainly what's happening is people are changing jobs, not via getting additional training, but just that the actual vacancy postings for better paying jobs rose, and they're just able to change jobs. Second question was about so there are two parts. One, this is only 4 years. How sustainable will this be? So I think there are two ways of thinking about this. And I mean, let me just say, in terms of will it be sustainable is not a question I can certainly answer. I don't know. But here's what I do know, that we have never seen a 3-year period where you reversed 40% of growth in inequality in wages in the U.S. The closest we came to was the late 1990s, when we had a high compressed labor market, and that actually did reduce some inequality to a certain degree, but nowhere near in the same amount as we saw in this period. What you had in the late 90s was more broad-based wage growth, where wage inequality stopped growing. You certainly did not reverse wage inequality, let alone that amount of it. So it's very unusual. And so that's the main thing I wanted you to take away from those comparisons, not because it'll be permanent, but rather that it's large. But in terms of permanence, what we see is that the higher tightness predicts inequality falling, that unless you basically go back to a much higher unemployment rate again, that is unlikely to just reverse itself in the next 3 years. So I think at the minimum, I would say in the medium run, we would expect this to continue, but not necessarily additional compression is not happening nearly as much. But nonetheless, the reductions that have happened seem to be, holding constant for now. But, it'll be interesting to see what happens. But that's partly going to depend on policy. If we have spent a lot more time with more than 5% unemployment rate in the United States after 1980 than we did before, until really the last 5-6 years. And so if we revert back to that, then I expect some of this changes to revert. Now, you talked about that I didn't mention anything about institutions. Well, actually, I did mention one of the two labor market institutions that's often talked about, which is the minimum wage in the U.S. And in fact, what's interesting is that if I kind of went over this fast, but if you look at the 2015 to 2019 period, there was some compression happening. That was driven largely by institutional factors. In particular in the U.S., it's the minimum wage that was actually rising in some states. What's interesting is that it's not that even though minimum wage has been rising fast in about half the states versus other half, it's basically constant in nominal terms, so falling in real terms. The compression is quite similar in both groups of states. So it's really driven by market forces in that sense, and not by minimum wage. Now, what about unions? Well, private sector union density in the United States is less than 5%. If you look at the low-wage workforce, it's even less, if that's possible to think of. So it really isn't, in terms of contributing to this compression, unions didn't play that much of a role. Having said that, what is really interesting is that we have seen a great uptick in labor militancy, if you will, in the last year. It's just that it's led to increasing organizing in the low-wage sector for the first time that I can think of. So about 5% of Starbucks stores today are unionized. 0% were before, 5 years ago. But it's a very small share. So it's not going to explain this huge increase in the relative wages that happened. At the same time, I think it also shows how tightness itself can likely, by reducing the cost of being fired, which is the main weapon that employers have against when workers are trying to organize, it can actually affect some of these institutional features. So the third question was about the timing. And isn't it the case that employment fell for the low-skilled workers? And so does that contradict the idea that this was actually the tightness that was causing it? So if you remember, I pointed out that this was why I thought it was unexpected, because if you look at the early stage of the pandemic, in 2020 in particular and part of 21, you actually had a huge reduction in employment. But that's not when the wages rose. What happened is subsequently what you saw employment recover, and not only recover, tightness, and I also glossed over this, but we don't only use tightness in terms of unemployment rate, but also look at job-to-job transition, because as it turns out, that has very good predictive power for wage growth at the bottom. But a variety of measures, vacancy to unemployment rate, which is an imperfect measure, but nonetheless, all of these measures show a very tight labor market at the bottom in mid-21 onwards, and that's exactly when the wage growth picked up. So the time series evidence certainly lines up with it, but moreover, what we're also doing is using cross-sectional evidence by looking across local labor markets and finding that, in fact, that change correlates quite well with not only when, but when and where wage growth occurred at the bottom. So the fourth question was about inflation, inflation inequality, and that was one of the buttons that I didn't press because I didn't have time. But we actually do look at that question, and it just turns out that even accounting for inflation and inequality, and I'll have a little more to say about that in a sec, maybe 5% of the phenomenon of compression that we find at most could be related to that. And the reason, and one additional thing, by the way, is that very recently the BLS actually put out the quartiles of inflation, and that does show inflation was a bit higher at the bottom, but compared to the nominal wage growth, which is just, it swamps the difference in inflation. But other measures, including work by Jaravel, finds actually that the inflation was probably highest in the middle. So the bottom actually, it was not as high. And the reason for that is because poor people, at least in the US, are less likely to drive, and that exposes them less to the increase in gas price than those in the middle in particular. But all of those, the differences in inflation experience, even while it is real and exists, is just swamped by the degree of differences in nominal wage growth. I think those are all the ones that at least I have, so I'll stop here.
Sure. So the questions put to me were both from Johan, so thanks a lot, Johan. So why no? Well, I mean, why no coordination? Yeah, indeed, we were quite surprised. We asked the authors, and basically the first thing we got at the end last year, there was just no information really on this at all. On those that the colleagues had talked about it, there was, at that time, I think, understandably, also a lot of conflict also between the social partners, or between labour and capital at that point in time. I mean, it may be that that's indeed a time issue, right? That it's taking some time for things to, as it were, to sort of settle down a little bit, and that might be part of it. I mean, I did some work several years ago about the disinflationary period after the oil price shocks of in the 1980s and 1970s, 1980s, and there it's fairly clear, and I think that's also in other literature, that I mean, you can, as it were, get the inflation back down again, through the sort of Volcker shock type things, or what Thatcher did in Britain, but a lot of European countries actually didn't go down that road. They used sort of corporatist incomes policy type measures, in my view, quite successfully to bring inflation down without having such a big negative macroeconomic shock and working through the Phillips curve. Of course, since then, quite a lot's happened, right? I mean, in many countries, both the degree of organisation on the labour side, and indeed the membership of employers' organisations has declined. So the purchase of these sort of more centralized levels has decreased. So it could be that the institutional apparatus has weakened since that time. In fact, I think that's quite likely. So that might be part of it. But that's something indeed to look at. And of course, trade unions are in a very difficult situation, right, where their members want protection from price increases, and at the same time they're under pressure from governments, and also they realize that we have to sort of get this disinflationary process going. I know we can't keep passing on these essentially imported price increases into domestic prices and wages, right? So it's a very difficult situation for them. It's a shame indeed that Lena Schubert, who was supposed to speak yesterday, couldn't come. She's now chief economist of the Austrian trade unions. It would have been interesting to hear her perspective on that. A couple of sentences on policy learning. So, I mean, there is some policy learning always sort of ongoing within the European institutions, in the various committees underpinning the work of the Council at the European level. But I think let me take the opportunity to say something a bit more about this divergence risk. I mean, I think that's where we need the coordination. Really, not something some policy learning will certainly be useful. I mean, I regret now slightly. I mean, I put up. Well, you saw the trajectories of the inflation rates over time, and I posted the last month and showed the divergence. Of course, probably would have made more sense from that perspective to sort of look at the indices, the price indices, and so the cumulative changes over time. I mean, some countries obviously perform better at the start and less well at the end, or the other way around, and that would sort of even out. But my suspicion is there's actually quite a lot of persistence in there, and that the indices have really opened up quite a lot. Now that might you know, of course, that could be a sort of adjustment towards a sort of equilibrium, if you like, in the sense, I mean, if Germany has been a bit higher than the average, if we need to get Germany a little bit less competitive in view of its current account surplus, that might be a good thing. But again, that would need to be looked at a bit more. But I think we're, as the Germans say, burn children from the euro crisis, and any sign that these pressures are building up again, I think is very worrying. And the sooner that something is done about that, and there are mechanisms, as I think you certainly know, Johan, and others maybe in the room know, to look at, to examine, and in principle at least to correct macroeconomic imbalances now in the euro area, and they should certainly be activated.
Well, thank you for the questions. Starting with the pricing of a rule of Petrobras. So what happened was that during the PT government, monitored prices were used quite often to control the inflation rate, and there was kind of a lot of disagreement with this type of behavior. So when the government changed, and there was this understanding that prices of oil in Brazil should follow the international price, there was a change in the pricing rule of Petrobras. We should remember that Petrobras is only half state-owned, so for the private owners, let's say, associating the price of oil in Brazil with the foreign price meant that when the foreign price increased, it would increase in Brazil as well, so they would be earning more profits. And this is what happened, and it was really weird because like last year we were seeing increases in oil prices and at the same time increases in the dividends paid by Petrobras. So the distributive effect is very clear, like it's really uncomfortable to a certain extent. And now Petrobras has announced that it won't follow this rule so strictly, so it will kind of absorb a bit the changes in foreign prices, because in a way these price changes, but they don't have anything to do, they're not so strongly related to changes in the costs of Petrobras. So there's no reason to keep these simultaneous changes. So that's what happened, and we'll see whether it lasts and if it has a positive effect. About the credit market question, I think you know more about credit markets in Brazil than I do. Like, it's not really something that I study so much. Those 50% in the free market are still very relevant. So what happens is that there are very, very high real interest rates for some types of credits. It's true that there is some subsidies to some sort of credits, but if we look at the credit card, for instance, it's 400% per year, usually the interest rate. So what happens, I think, is that if the base interest rate changes from 10% to 12%, what is the impact if the interest rate was 400%? It's almost inexistent. So this is part of the explanation why this demand channel is not so relevant in Brazil, because it's very likely that changes in the base interest rate are not really affecting credit demand, because there aren't very significant changes in credit for consumers. So I think this kind of reinforces my point that the exchange rate is the main transmission channel. So I would go through that direction. And about Ezra's question about exchange rate. So first, just to clarify, I'm not sure whether I would say that it's good that the exchange rate is used to control the distributive conflict in Brazil. It was more just a diagnosis of what happens. But then it's true that some people would argue that, okay, an appreciated domestic currency hurts the tradable goods sector, and that can be bad for the Brazilian economy. What I think that may be happening now is that when the exchange rate depreciates, it is benefiting part of the tradable goods sector, which is the agricultural sector, and there's a lot of technological progress in that sector, but I'm not really keen of the fact that it's earning so much profits. Like, it's really very powerful people that really affect the politics in the country, so it's a complicated redistributive process. And then the other part of the tradable goods sector, which would be the industry, what we have been seeing is this kind of weird effect that it's not benefiting so much when there is a depreciation of the domestic currency, because it's so dependent on imported inputs. So the only way to change this is to really promote more complex industry firms in Brazil, because otherwise we will be trapped in the situation in which firms cannot really benefit from any increase in farm prices, they don't get more competitive, and we are kind of in the same place as before. So I think it's a bit more complex than we would think from a theoretical standpoint. That's it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So we can have a last very quick round of questions, because there was some. Okay, Raphael Wildauer, and then here over there. Yes. So Raphael, please start.
Yes, thank you very much. Quick question for Arin. You effectively argue that a lot of these low-paid jobs, people are not working in these anymore. So what happened to these jobs? Is it that these industries simply decided we don't need them anymore? I don't know, we can deal with 5 waiters instead of 10? Or they are now, these jobs are filled by people who are not in the statistics, I don't know, below 16s or above 65s, or yeah, just what is really, what happened there? Why don't we need, or does the US economy doesn't need these jobs anymore, so to say? Thank you.
Thank you. I think it was a great session. My question is to Arin again. So 2 questions. One is that does this wage compression play out when you look at immigrant versus non-immigrant workforce, especially because there might be a reason to expect that more immigrant workers are in, jobs which don't allow remote working, also maybe multiple jobs in the gig economy. And secondly, I think it's a nice story. It's even if it's just for a temporary period, but my broader question is, we can't really wait for a pandemic to lead to, decline in monopsony in tight labor markets. So apart from minimum wage, what kind of institutional policy would you look at if you were to suggest decreasing monopsony power in labor markets? Thanks.
Thank you. I'll try to be brief as well. I have very similar questions to Arin Dube. What in your interpretation, what drives the difference in labor market developments in the US versus the EU? In the US being much tighter, was it the initial push of the Biden administration's COVID response? Or is it something else that is happening that is now changing the power of workers? Because I think what we see now, it's not surprising, as Raphael has described, this productivity whip, as we call it in German-speaking Keynesian sort of understanding, for firms to be raising wages and therefore having to increase productivity. So that is what we would expect to be seeing. Thank you.
Okay, if I'm not mistaken, all the questions were for Arin, so yep. Okay. Please respond.
All right. So what happened to low-paid jobs? So, one of the slides I didn't show was the reallocation. So basically, we're reallocating away from lowest productivity to higher productivity firms. Now, in the analysis I showed you, I was looking at the sectoral level. That's the easiest way to look at it. In other data, using matched employer-employee data that we're only started to look more recently, we actually eventually want to look within industry across firms. And in both cases, though, what we see is a reallocation away from low productivity, likely, to higher productivity firms. So what happens to these jobs? Well, they're actually quite simply not filled, because they're instead done by someone else some of the times, especially if it's within industry. I mean, one of the things I think that, and this ties in with the last question too, what happens when you have less tight labor market is that you fill up the economy with low-wage, low-productivity firms that just otherwise have a very hard time existing, but that actually also does put downward pressure on both wages and productivity. So it's part of the productivity whip is within firm, but part of it is actually across firm reallocation. We just haven't seen quite as dramatic an impact on that front until recently, because we haven't had this type level of tightness in a long long time. That also does connect with the question, the second question of, well, what other things can you do in order to reduce monopsony power? Maybe I didn't stress this enough, but I don't think you need a pandemic to do this. We could have done this, in fact, all along. And that actually is one of the arguments that I would make, and I have a book coming out next year. It's called The Wage Standard, is that essentially we let our macro policy really veer away from any pretense of doing full employment after 1980, and as a result, we spent a lot more time with above 5% unemployment rate than we used to before 1980. And surprise, surprise, we've seen inequality rise. Is it the only reason? No, but it is an important reason. And so, there's a lot of focus on monopsony, actually, these days. Actually, I was just at a Handbook of Labor Economics conference this morning, where there's a presentation, the whole chapter is going to be on monopsony this time around. And so mainstream economics has really started paying attention to this issue. But one of the things that people talk about is, well, has monopsony power increased? Well, what does that mean? Well, one simple thing is source of monopsony power is just a slack labor market. So, in fact, this is an important aspect of macro policy, which has a distributional impact through the functioning of the labor market. And that can happen in a non-union sector. Of course, it can also happen through a union sector. For example, we're seeing more workers strike now, and this is not surprising to anyone here, that tighter labor market increases labor's bargaining power. But what it also does, it has this allocative effect, potentially, of reallocating work away from businesses with business models that really rely on being able to recruit and retain workers with low wages. And when that is taken away from you, then businesses actually have to adapt differently, or they simply lose workers who then migrate to other places. So and then the final question is, why is U.S. different? I think that's a great question. I think we have some sense of why, and then other more tentative and open questions. There's one aspect that's, I think, a unintended consequence of U.S. dysfunction. And so what I mean by that is that, because we were in some really bizarre way unable to enact relief during COVID era using something like a furlough plan, or plans that were done in Germany, UK, and other places. We instead used the policy system that we actually had relatively better developed, which is the unemployment insurance system. It led people to actually relief not be tied to the place of work. Right? This is actually a failure. In general, we think short-time work and work sharing is actually a good thing we want to encourage to keep workers tied to the workplace. Now, but here's the thing. Do you really want workers to be tied to a really crappy job? Because in America, we have a lot of crappy jobs. And so ironically, when we reduced the tie of workers to those jobs, it actually allowed people to be more footloose. And so that's a more peculiar setting, but I think in many ways, the more standard setting is that we also at the same time really provided a type of relief that we haven't in a downturn that I can think of. And as a result, people actually had more liquid savings that allowed them to then spend it down over a period. And just generally, I think the kind of macro policy we pursued allowed for a fiscal policy in particular we pursued that allowed for a tightness to develop we just haven't allowed that to happen in a long time. And I think that's a more general lesson, right? Because it's not, if the lesson were something specific to pandemic or the peculiarity that we literally provided, relief through unemployment benefits during a pandemic, those would be interesting, but not particularly generalizable. But I think the aspect of tightness and how that actually is a pretty standard thing that we just do a lot less of, well, that's really generalizable and actionable policy that if we want to actually tackle inequality.
So, before you now leave to the dinner, two important announcements. First of all, thanks very much for all the presenters here on the panel. Including the audience and every discussant here in the room. And secondly, I wanted to point again to the forthcoming summer school of the network next year, July, August 2024. So specifically for the younger ones, obviously. So if you're interested in that, there's more information in the program. So give it a look. And now enjoy the dinner.